Hello, happy Monday. I hope you are all doing well and that you've been finding the readings interesting. And I hope you've all had a good weekend as well. So, last class period, last Wednesday, we finally finished up our second unit in class, which was looking at different ethical theories about what it means to live a moral or ethical life, what makes an action moral or immoral. And today we're going to be transitioning into a new unit, our third unit which is going to be working on applying these ethical theories to various ethical issues that we're facing today in society. And the readings that I assigned for you today were Peter Singer's Animal Liberation and Aldo Leopold's The Land Ethic. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about what Peter Singer has to say about animal ethics, and so it's going to be tied to that reading, Chapter 1 of Animal Liberation. So if you haven't already watched or listened to the song that is in the lecture notes for this lecture, go ahead and do that first and think about what that has to do with what I'm going to be saying in the lecture today, as well as what the reading has to say about animal rights and animal ethics. So the philosopher that I'm going to talk about in this lecture is Peter Singer. He's a contemporary Australian moral philosopher. He's still around. He was born in 1946, and he's written on several topics in ethics, such as famine, utilitarianism, veganism, animal ethics, and animal rights more generally. And he's kind of well known for synthesizing his utilitarian viewpoints with modern moral issues. So, again, like I said, he's written on the morality or the ethics of trying to alleviate famines. He's written on veganism. And what we're going to be talking about today is how we ought to treat animals if we're trying to treat them ethically and whether or not they have rights or not. As we'll see, and as you probably got from the reading, Singer thinks that animals do or should have certain rights. And what he's going to basically criticize modern society for is not taking animals' interests and suffering into consideration when we're setting up our agricultural practices and other social practices and things like that. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So I had you read chapter 1 from his famous book, Animal Liberation. I'm going to provide some general notes about this reading and what Singer is doing in this piece, and then we're going to talk about what he says in the reading more specifically. The same format that we've been doing this entire time. So, Singer's main goal in this piece is to bring awareness to the discrimination that he's seeing, at least against animals. He notes that, humans recently, within the last 100 years, have been focused mainly on making sure that other humans don't get discriminated against and that everybody is being treated fairly and they're not having their rights violated. He wants to focus our attention on the way animals are treated in Western industrialized nations. He's talking mostly about the United States, but it can apply to other countries as well. He wants us to take a real close look at the way we treat animals in this country, and he's going to say that basically we're treating them immorally and we need to change a lot of societal practices. So he's going to draw attention to the way animals have been historically treated, and he's going to try to convince us that we need to change our attitudes about animals and the way that we currently think about them. The first thing that he talks about in this piece, more specifically, is he makes a brief case for animal rights. So in order to do this, he looks at the ways humans have been granted rights throughout history and what that means exactly. So he notes from the outset that when we grant rights to people or when we presume that people have rights, it's not based on the fact that we're all sort of physically or mentally equal in some way. Because it's obvious that we give rights to people or we allow people to have rights that are not physically the same as us, they're not mentally the same as us, So he says basically that human rights are not based on actual equality. So when people say that animals are not like us, so they shouldn't have rights, that's kind of missing the point of what rights are supposed to do and why we give people rights in the first place. He notes that rights are not based on what sex you are, or race, or physical characteristics, or at least they shouldn't be. After all, everybody's different. People come in different shapes and sizes, and they have different physical characteristics. He says also that we don't give people rights or respect people's rights because they have a certain level of intelligence either. Mentally retarded people, those who have mental disabilities, they still have rights that ought to be respected. So rights don't seem to be based on having a certain level of intelligence or a certain level of uh, uh, intellectual capacity. Um, the same thing with children, right? Children generally don't really know what's going on. If they're really young, they're generally not very smart. But still, we think that children are deserving of rights and their rights need to be respected as well. So, what Singer's trying to do by talking about these different characteristics of rights and how we treat rights is he's trying to point out that rights and how we respect people's rights aren't based on what they're physically like. They're not based on how intelligent or smart that they are. Rather, it seems that we base rights on what he calls the capacity for suffering. We recognize that the people around us, they have the capacity to be able to suffer, and we don't want to see people suffer unnecessarily or unfairly or unjustly. So, what he says is we kind of already base human rights on this capacity for suffering, so that's what we should base animal rights on too. He says rights in the treatment of animals, therefore, should be based on the extent to which they have this capacity to suffer at the hands of other people or at the hands of other animals. So, insofar as all humans and all animals have the capacity to suffer, their interests and their lives and their projects should be given a certain amount of consideration. And what he's going to say about contemporary Western society is that generally the lives and the interests of animals are not being given the moral consideration that they should be. Uh, he's going to argue that it is the capacity for suffering that allows us and other animals to form interests and preferences at all. If we didn't have the capacity to suffer, we wouldn't have the ability to distinguish things in our lives that we think are good and things that are bad, things that promote our interests and things that don't. It's the capacity for suffering that allows us to organize our lives in ways in which uh, we can go after and pursue those things that are good for us and avoid the things that are bad for us. He says on page 6, if a being suffers, there can be no moral justification for refusing to take that suffering into consideration. And this kind of claim is what he's going to base his entire view of animal ethics on. Because animals have the capacity to suffer, they also should enjoy some sort of moral consideration. We should think about the ways that our actions are going to impact animals and whether or not what we do are going to help out animals or hurt animals. So that's kind of what he has to say about animal rights, namely that rights are based on a capacity for suffering, and we ought to respect that both humans and animals have the capacity to suffer and kind of use that as a consideration in how we set up society and treat other people and other animals. The next thing that he talks about in this piece is he actually looks at the ways in which we are treating animals currently. And he's going to say, look, we've been dropping the ball a lot. We have not been giving animals the moral consideration that they deserve. He outlines this view that he calls speciesism, which he thinks is a fundamental part of how we treat other humans and animals in the United States. Speciesism is the view that a particular species' interests or lives are worthy of more consideration than other species' interests and lives. So, an example of speciesism would be taking consideration of what dogs want and how to promote dogs' lives, and thinking that cats are just dumb and you don't really care about cats at all. Basing um, how you treat a certain species on what species that animal is what Singer is going to call speciesism. And he thinks this kind of view is morally reprehensible. We shouldn't try, or we shouldn't assume that because we're humans, that our lives or our interests are worthy of more consideration than other animals' interests and lives. And this is something that he's going to rail against in this piece. He's going to argue that a lot of what we do nowadays in our society is speciesist, and therefore it's immoral. He says that we care more about humans than we do about animals, and that impacts how we treat other humans and animals. And what that leads us to do is set up systems in which we're not really caring about animals in the ways that we should. He outlines in this piece several human practices that he thinks are speciesist and therefore immoral. So one of these is meat consumption. He thinks that meat consumption is immoral because he thinks that we don't actually need to eat meat for nutrition. We've set up this giant agricultural and food production system in which we slaughter animals and we take their meat from them and we eat that meat, but we don't actually need to be doing that, Singer thinks. He thinks that we could actually have a good diet and get the nutrition that we need on a vegan diet. So the fact that we're breeding animals and keeping them in these factory farming facilities in which they're getting beaten and kept in small little cages and basically being bred so that we can eat them, he thinks that this is very immoral. And if we actually cared for animals, if we cared for cows and pigs and chickens, we wouldn't actually be doing that. Again, meat production itself, he thinks, is immoral. This is because the current way that we're producing meat is not being respectful of what animals want and the kinds of lives that they could be living. Factory farming makes countless animals suffer. The way that animals are treated during that process, a lot of people think is inhumane, and animals should be treated with more respect than they currently are. And Singer definitely agrees with this. He's going to say, look, the way that we've set up food production in the United States treats animals really shittily, pardon my language. And he's going to say that's a real problem that we need to address. And insofar as we're looking at these different ethical theories and we're trying to lead ethical lives, it's obvious that the way that we're treating animals right now, he's going to say, is very unethical. We don't really care about their suffering. It doesn't really figure into our moral consideration all that much. And that's something that we need to change. Another practice that he says that we engage in that we don't need to, and that is making a lot of animals suffer and is immoral, is fur and leather production. He says that we make products out of fur and leather, like boots and jackets and coats that we don't really need. We could get by without them. But the ways in which we do that are also immoral towards animals. If you look at the lecture notes, you'll notice that I have links to some YouTube videos that show examples of how animals are treated during these various practices in food production and consumption, in fur and leather production, and in animal experimentation, like testing our products on animals before we use them on ourselves. He says that the ways in which we are doing these things are causing these animals to suffer unnecessarily. And that's something that we really need to look at if we're going to be leading ethical lives. The practice that I just mentioned, animal experimentation, is another thing that Singer talks about in this piece. He says that the psychological testing that we do on animals to try to learn more about minds and brains, and the physical testing that we do on animals when, we put certain chemicals on them to see how they react to it. We test shampoos and makeups on them. The ways in which these testings are done is not being respectful towards the animal's capacity for suffering. And the fact that we're doing it this way makes it immoral, and it privileges our species above other species. If we're going to talk about this with regards to the specific ethical theories that we've looked at, I think that they say different things about the way animals should be treated. So let's start off with utilitarianism. So Singer is a utilitarian. He believes that generally what we should be doing is we should be performing those actions that maximize happiness or utility and minimize those actions that produce suffering and sadness and pain. And he is going to include animals in this analysis too. He's going to say we need to look at just not at what the consequences of our actions are going to have on humans, but we need to look also at the pain and suffering and pleasure that our actions can have on animals as well. So he says that if we're going to do a utilitarian analysis, we need to include the ways in which animals can potentially be benefited or hurt or harmed through our practices. And we need to include that when we're trying to determine whether or not an action is moral or immoral. What he's going to say, obviously, is that the way in which we're doing things now is causing much more suffering than needs to be. He's going to say, the food practices that we have, the fur and leather production that we're engaged in, the animal experimentation that we're doing, all of these things could be much more ethical than they are now because they're producing unnecessary suffering for the animals. It's obvious that we get a lot of good things out of, being able to eat meat and being able to wear leather and, being able to put shampoo on our heads that doesn't burn our scalps because we tested it on animals first. But he's going to say there are ways of getting around some of those issues while treating animals ethically. And so if we're going to lead an ethical life following the theory of utilitarianism, we really should be considering animals more in our lives than we actually are, because the ways that we're currently treating them are bad and immoral and speciesist. Now, like I said, I've included some videos that kind of provide empirical support for what Singer is saying here and what I'm saying, which is that animals are not treated ethically in a lot of these practices. Watch these videos at your own peril because they are pretty graphic and they are going to rub a lot of people the wrong way. The ways in which we currently treat animals, I think I can honestly say, a lot of times is really barbaric, and these videos are trying to capture that. So you have been forewarned. If you're going to watch those videos, do so at your own discretion. Just be aware that some of the videos can be pretty graphic, and you can kind of go down a rabbit hole watching these videos. So, what Singer is basically saying in this piece is we need to drastically change the ways in which we are treating and thinking about animals. Our current practices of meat consumption and meat production and animal experimentation are deeply immoral because they make these animals suffer unnecessarily, and we could get on in society just fine without these practices. Now, that's a utilitarian analysis of how we treat animals. If we're going to apply some of the other ethical theories, it gets a little bit more messy. So what would Kant have to say about animal treatment? Or what would deontology have to say about animal treatment? Well, if you're following Kant specifically, he doesn't think that animals can be rational. So he's basically going to say, you can treat animals kind of however you want. They're not deserving of any sort of treatment because only humans or only rational beings can be moral creatures and are deserving of moral consideration. Since animals are not rational beings, they're not worthy of moral consideration. However, if you're going to kind of step away from Kant a little bit, but you still kind of like the deontology that he presents in his ideas. Uh, there still is a deontological defense that you could provide for treating animals better, and that is just to admit that uh, maybe we shouldn't treat animals just as means. You know, you don't have to buy into Kant's idea that only rational beings are deserving of moral treatment. Um, and you can still hold his view, you know, that if we're trying to determine the morality or immorality of an action, we try to universalize the maxim, or we try to see whether or not we're treating that thing merely as a means. And if you just held to those principles, you could provide a deontological argument for saying that the way we currently treat animals is immoral. On virtue ethics, it's a little harder to get an answer on this. You know, virtue ethics is going to say what's moral is what follows from, you know, your virtuous dispositions, and whether or not you're trying to make yourself more perfect and improve yourself and become a better person. So it's a little harder to say whether or not uh, we can say animals are being treated immorally on a virtue ethicist account. I think you could provide an argument either way for the claim that we are treating animals immorally on Aristotle's account. You could say, you know, um, the way that we're treating animals right now, because it makes a bunch of people feel bad and because it's bad to the animals, that's not helping you cultivate any virtuous dispositions. So you might want to stop doing that. You could say that. Or you could say, you know, the kind of diet that we get from meat consumption is what's going to help you, you know, build up your body and mind as strong as it can be. You know, that's kind of like an empirical claim, a claim about diet and nutrition, and we can talk about that. But basically, if you're trying to look at this through a virtue ethics lens, it's not immediately obvious whether or not eating and producing meat and fur and leather is moral or immoral. It's a little more messy. The ethics of care, I think, is a little more clear, but it's still a little bit messy. Um, you can extend the range of beings over which you have responsibility to include animals, right? Held says that one of the fundamental features of an ethics of care is making sure that the needs of for those which we are responsible are being met. If you broaden that to include animals, you could definitely make a case that the way that we're treating animals right now is not really caring for them. It's not getting them what they need, and it's kind of immoral. Um, Alternatively, if you think that the ethics of care theory just includes humans, then you know you're not really going to be all that concerned with how animals are treated, because what matters to you is whether or not humans are getting the mental and physical needs met. So again, it can kind of go both ways depending on how you look at it. Uh, in any case, um, in the field of animal ethics, what Singer is going to say ultimately is that the way that we're currently treating animals is immoral, and that needs to change. Precisely because when we're taking into account, you know, the net good or net suffering that our actions produce, he thinks that we should include animals under that umbrella as well. You know, dogs and cats, cows, insects, dolphins, all that stuff. Um, you know, you can agree or disagree with that, but that's pretty much what he thinks. So, I think that's a pretty good overview of animal ethics, and in applying the different ethical theories that we've looked at to some of the practices that we're engaged in now in our treatment of animals. But what do you guys think? Do you think that we're currently treating animals immoral? Um, do you think that eating meat is fine and the way that we're producing meat right now is fine? Um, because Singer's argument relies on this view that a lot of our practices are speciesist, he's going to say they're immoral because of that reason. But do you think speciesism is bad or wrong? Do you think that we should all basically consider other species equally as we consider our own lives and our own interests? Or do you think it's justifiable that we privilege human life above other animal life? I'm really curious to hear what y'all think about this. So, ask questions, post in the discussion boards, and I think we can have a really cool conversation about this stuff. In any case, that's pretty much it for this reading. Pretty simple, pretty easy. And I'll see you in the next video talking about environmental ethics. Okay, have a great day.